All right. So yes, thank you. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Will. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Um, yes, I'll be covering off on what we've learned about water quality and the ecological health of Tuggerah Lakes. And a lot of this will be relating to the previous presentations you've seen on the catchment and also the entrance and hydrodynamics of the lake system. So first of all, I'll just overview of the aim. So what we were trying to do was really understand the nature of the Tuggerah Lake system and how it's changed over time, and how that sort of really controls or determines our experience of the lakes. And an important part of that is to understand how climatic variations, so the seasonal patterns in rainfall and wind and etc., as well as things like La Nina and El Nino and even longer period climatic variations, what sort of impact they have on lake water quality and the ecological processes. We're also obviously interested on how the condition of the lake entrance affects water quality in the lake, what the main pollutant sources in the lake were and how they impacted on water quality. Of course, what causes rack and ooze problems in the lake, and then how these vary in space and time around the lake. And then, of course, what the management options for the rack and ooze were in the near shore of the lake, given the analysis of those factors that impact on these. So the approach taken was to review all of the existing literature on the lake. So all of those, that huge list of reports that you're aware of, but also I undertook quite a lot of new analysis of existing water quality data and rain and also climatic data to try to answer some of these questions based on what was out there. And so that included a data set which was more than 10 years old. So it gave an opportunity to really sort of tease out some of these problems. So, but of course, the challenges we faced were that the historical data sets are only limited to, the past decade or two. So we struggled looking back in time to how the lakes were obviously before European settlement, but also during the times when there were a lot less people and a lot less developing in the catchment. So I'll just start off by giving a sort of an overview of the key attributes of the Tuggerah Lakes, I'll preface this section by saying that Tuggerah Lakes is quite a unique lake system. It's obviously one of the biggest lake systems in New South Wales, but it has a lot of physical and ecological attributes that make it stand out as quite unique. It's bordered by Lake Macquarie to the south, and then to the Myall Lakes and Wallace Lakes to the north. All of these lakes are unique in their own way. So there is no, whilst they share some common attributes, they really are unique beasts in their own right. So Tuggerah Lakes is one of the key defining attributes is it's very shallow. It's a broad basin, open to and exposed to winds from all directions, and that is really a defining physical attribute of the lake. It has a fairly, as you've heard in previous nights, it has a constrained entrance that's prone to closing or becoming constricted during extended bright dry periods. And that leads to tidal exchange being very limited to approximately 1% of the lake volume per day. The water levels in the lake, they don't vary much on a diurnal or a daily cycle, but more over a fortnightly tidal cycle due to spring and neap tides, and also in response to rainfall and evaporation, and due to wind forcing. And I'm sure that Dave outlined all of that. But those things actually really impact on water quality dynamics and also the overall experience that people have of the lake. The freshwater flows are really dominated by floods from the major creeks. So if you quantify the total amount of fresh water that comes into the lakes on an annual basis, it's really dominated by Arimba Creek, Wyong Creek, and Wallara Creek. Most of that water is actually transported out into the ocean. It tends to skate over the lake basin because it's fresh and the lake is usually salty. So the less dense fresh water sort of forms a lens, which is transported out. There's also a lot of groundwater inputs that we're starting to learn about from the fringing catchments, the low-lying wetlands and fringing sands, and these are potentially very important. Those fringing wetlands and salt marsh habitats, due to the water level variation, they're really integral parts of the lake ecosystem. And the lakes really support a very extensive seagrass habitat, one of the largest and most extensive in New South Wales. And these seagrasses support diverse fish and bird life. So I'll just move on to a little bit of detail about the influence of climate. As I alluded to before, the lake water quality and ecology is really one of the major controls on this is seasonal and interannual and decadal variation in rainfall, temperature, and wind. These things, if we look at all of the water quality data that we have and analyze that as a function of time, either month or years, we can see very strong patterns. And as everyone will be aware, the cycles of El Nino and La Nina, which occur over 5 to 10 year cycles, have really very marked effect on the sort of weather that we see along the coast of New South Wales in particular. And that's no different in Tuggerah Lakes. But on top of that, we have these what we call decadal variation in climate, which is I've sort of highlighted the influence of the interdecadal Pacific Oscillation. It's a climatic phenomenon which interacts with that El Nino, La Nina to create extended dry periods and extended periods of flood-dominated conditions. So these sort of things really influence the way the lake system functions.
And Angus, just to be clear there, by decadal you mean that's sort of a rhythm decades long?
Yeah, so 20 to 40 years long. So we see, so for example, we see in the climatic record of New South Wales, we see what are called flood dominated and drought dominated periods. So for example, in the first part of the 20th century, we were in the midst of a drought dominated period up until the late 1940s, and then we switched into a flood dominated period. So that was the time when the 1950s floods, the major 1960s floods, the 1970s and the 80s. We had a much higher frequency of large flood events during that period. After that, we switched over into a drought dominated period, which meant that the frequency and magnitude of floods diminished. It's not to say that there weren't very large rainfall events. It just meant that they just occurred less frequently, and that's been observed in rainfall records along the New South Wales coast. So what this means in terms of being on the ground in a place like Tuggerah Lakes, due to the influence of these climatic cycles, the rain, temperature, and wind, the sort of things that you experience the environmental conditions you experience around the lake, such as rack and ooze accumulations. They're very different from year to year, and they, it may come and go at various places. It, may appear in a place for a couple of years and then disappear. So from the analysis of the available data that we've got to hand, we believe that this variation is in large part driven by these climatic cycles. And this obviously leads to a major challenge, because these climatic cycles have interacted with the incremental modification of the catchment since European settlement, and that really complicates our interpretation of anecdotal accounts of lake condition over time. So we have to nuance, or we have to sort of, when we look back at what the reports are of prawn catches and fish catches back in the 1920s, we have to think back and that has to be looked at in the context of what the climate was at the time, or the weather and climate was at the time. So just to touch on, notwithstanding that, what we did as part of this was to have a look at available anecdotal evidence and historical photos to try to get an idea of what the lake looked like before its current state. So in the 1940s, we're in the middle of this phase of growth of agriculture and forestry, largely within the rural catchment. There was sort of small urban developments springing up around the lake, and in this photo you can see a 1941 aerial from the war years of the Long Jetty region. So the road network was in, but really the density of housing was very low. So the clearing of the wider catchment for agriculture and forestry greatly increased the sediment and nutrient loads via the main creeks into the main lake basin. But the system itself, the lake system itself, was probably, relatively close to what it would have been in pre-European times. So you can see that along the Long Jetty shoreline, or the shallows of the Long Jetty shoreline, they were dominated by clean sands and exposed to strong tidal or wind currents along there, and that's evidenced by these sand ridges. This is all under the water, so the water's very clear, and you can see that the Long Jetty shoreline near shore is dominated by sand. The seagrass and macroalgae were really they dominated the shallow lake basins. So they were growing in much deeper water because of the clearer water allowed light to enable them to establish there. And of course, at that stage, the shorelines were very low gradient and sandy shorelines, and that was one of the key attributes of the system at the time. From the 1960s to present, that was really marked by really intense urban development of the lake fringes. So that greatly increased the sediment and nutrient loads to those fringing or nearshore areas, and what we witnessed was a rapid increase in ecological impacts. So, excuse me. So we saw the cumulative impacts of catchment erosion and sediment to the lake basin caused much higher turbidity or cloudiness of the water. That reduced the light penetration through the water and caused the seagrass to migrate into those shallow regions. So now we have in 2020, all of those shallow shoals are now colonized by seagrass and macroalgae. That increase in urbanization has really greatly increased the nutrient inputs to that nearshore zone. And one of the features is that virtually every street has a stormwater drain discharging into the nearshore zone. And you basically, so every small rainfall event runs off and discharges nutrient-rich and sediment-rich water into that nearshore zone. And significantly, that combined with the presence of seagrass and macroalgae has effectively created the barrier between the lake basin and the nearshore zone. So these two zones of the lake have become decoupled, as we say. So the water doesn't really exchange freely between the two zones, and that creates a sort of a stagnant water pool along that zone. So that tends to trap all of this urban stormwater, and really is one of the major causes of poor water quality issues. The other factor is, or the other major thing that's happened, is that shorelines have been greatly modified in recent years. So most significantly, probably, especially in this part of the lake, during the Tuggerah Lakes Restoration Project, when there was an effort to dredge the macroalgae and seagrass from this zone, and that dredge spoil was used to create these artificial shorelines. So essentially, this pretty much at the moment. I'll move on to the influence of the entrance on the water quality. So for this, we utilised, or to assess this issue, we utilised that 15-year data set that I alluded to at the beginning, and I had a look at. We were able to have a look at the water quality dynamics during the periods when the entrance was well and truly open, so tidal exchange was good, and compare it with times when the entrance was effectively closed or effectively closed, such as from mid 2018 to the flood in early 2020. Yes. Anyway, so during the open entrance conditions, ocean exchange is in that entrance channel shown in this picture is quite good. So it causes that to be dominated by oceanic water, as people will be well aware. The tidal exchange in the lake basin is considerably less, and it causes just a gradual increase in salinity over monthly timescales, but there's really no measurable impact on any other water quality parameters such as turbidity or nutrients. And the reason for this is because wind-driven resuspension of lake sediments is really the main driver of water quality in the lake basin, outside of those, brief flood times. The tidal exchange.
Sorry, Angus. Wind-driven resuspension. Just make sure we understand what you're referring to there.
Oh, okay. So what I'm referring to there is I said before how wide open the lake basins are. So basically, any of the prevailing strong winds set up quite large wind waves on the lake, and people will be well familiar with this. In the afternoon on a windy nor'easter or a sou'easter, the waves on the main lake basin become quite large, relatively large, and because the lake basin is quite shallow, that wave energy tends to stir up the bed, the sediments at the bottom of the lake, and that causes turbidity or cloudiness in the water. But it also increases nutrient concentrations, and also things like microalgae concentrations. So that process of what we call wind-driven resuspension is really the main, as we would measure it in that lake basin. And I told you before about this concept of decoupling. between the lake basin and that nearshore zone. People will be probably well aware of the fact that on a windy day, the nearshore zone can be quite clear, whilst out in the lake basin, it's very clear and calm. Whilst on the lake basin, it's quite there's large waves and the water is very cloudy. That basically is due to that decoupling and the dampening effect of the seagrass and the rack barriers on that wave energy. And due to that effect, the tidal exchange through the entrance really does not influence the water quality in the nearshore zone, and we have quite a decent, large data set to demonstrate that. And during this period, it's Lake Munmora is considerably fresher than the other lakes, and I will. And that's only since the pumping of the Munmora power station ceased. So that basically is due to the fact that the Budgie Channel is not hydraulically efficient enough to sort of couple the lakes in terms of water quality.
And again, just to be clear, but in that statement, when you say is fresher, is that basically saying less salty? It's not about water quality, but about salt. Is that?
Yes, thank you, Stuart. Yes, so I'm trying to be too brief here. Yeah, so it's less salty. So basically, it's not as affected by tidal exchange as the other lakes. So it's not as the input of salt from the ocean is less in Lake Munmora during that period. During the closed entrance period, what we saw in the data was that lake levels increase and salinity decreases, so the lake becomes fresher in response to just incremental inputs of rainfall and creek flows. And during this period, the conditions in Lake Munmora become very similar to the other lakes. So I'll move on to rack and ooze around the lakes. So everyone will probably be well familiar with the various issues and the way this is expressed around the lake. And what I'd like to do here is to sort of really highlight some of the main physical forcing attributes or factors that affect the way the things that we see around the lake in terms of these things. So the first thing is shoreline aspect, that is which direction the shoreline faces, and the wind climate. And in wind climate, I mean the direction and wind direction and strength. Those two factors really strongly determine the localized susceptibility to poor water quality, rack accumulation, and ooze development around the lake. So in these two examples, you can see in a shoreline that faces due southeast, as in this photo on the left, it's open to a lot of wave energy from those strong southeast winds. So what that tends to do is to really force the rack up onto the shoreline, as opposed to shorelines that are much more protected from wave energy. The rack tends to accumulate in the water against the shoreline. So, and one point to be made here is that wind direction and strength varies seasonally and interannually. So again, going back to that slide I showed, climatic controls, the nature of this forcing factor, as we say, varies in time, and so in some years, we might have a prevalence of northeast wind, really strong northeast winds, that will affect those shorelines that are exposed to those winds. in a different way to the other ones, and vice versa for southeast years where southeast winds predominate. Obviously, the shoreline gradient plays a really important role in terms of whether material is trapped in the water, as in the right-hand photo, or whether or not it's forced up onto the shoreline in the left-hand photo. The other thing is that if we look at the wind wave energy for any particular shoreline averaged over a long period of time, that really determines whether the sediments on the beach and in that sort of shallow part of the shore, that determines whether that's sandy or muddy. So again, if the shoreline tends to be a lot more protected from all of the major winds, finer sediment tends to accumulate there. It's just basically because there's less energy to push that sediment into the water, and so it tends to settle out there. So that really is one of the major that is one of the major factors as to whether or not we sort of see ooze developing in a particular shoreline. So some shorelines, such as along Berkeley Vale, have on average much less wind wave energy, and therefore they're much more susceptible to ooze development. So briefly on to ooze and what it is. I'll preface this by saying not all sediments that we find along the shorelines of lakes and estuary qualify as ooze. Organic rich muds, or fine sediments, they're very much a normal part of estuarine ecosystems. However, in those parts of Tuggerah where we have problem ooze accumulations, that's really a sign that the system is out of balance. So ooze in that context, really, what we've analysed, or there's studies that have analysed the composition of this material, and it's basically made up of fine sediments, clays and sands, and very fine sediments, a lot of organic matter, and that organic matter is sourced from things like algae, macroalgae, that lettuce weed that you might see, and other forms of microalgae, such as microscopic algae in the water, seagrass rack, and also leaf litter from stormwater. But it's this algal derived material which is really what makes the ooze smelly. And what we found is that, or what the data show is that seagrass rack only really comprises about 15% of those ooze sediments on average. That's really, and I've just stressed that that's just the ooze sediments themselves. It's not the rack that might be sort of accumulated very nearby or close to those sediments. So looking at the ooze formation, and the major contributing factors, stagnant water due to that decoupling effect between the nearshore and the lake basin is a major factor. So and that's caused by the the accumulation of rack, as in those sort of offshore, almost like reefs of rack, but also the growth of macroalgae. And that tends to, what that tends to do is actually trap the stormwater. As you see in this photo here, along the Berkeley Vale shoreline, you can see that this cloudy stormwater after a small rain event has been trapped in this small area in here. That stuff is really nutrient rich and stimulates the growth of that algae in that part of the system. The effectiveness of those barriers in terms of decoupling the nearshore and the basin is also really highly affected by water levels. So obviously when the water level is low, the barriers become much more effective, and it tends to trap the water, that dirty water close to the shore. When the lake level is higher, there's much greater exchange between the nearshore and the lake basin. So that nutrient-rich stormwater from all of those stormwater drains along the nearshore, it tends to become very concentrated in the nearshore zone during periods when you have an effective barrier and stagnation of the water. And those nutrients stimulate the growth of algae, which is a major contributor to the formation of this smelly black ooze, as opposed to the normal sort of muddy sediment. And we also have emerging evidence that groundwater inputs may be a significant source of nutrients in some location. And I'll note that Graham Hankin asked a question about this in relation to the sewage treatment plant up near Canton Beach. And I would agree with Graham's question there. I think that is in a region where there is evidence of groundwater inputs to the system. So it's one of those, it's potentially a significant source. We don't really know enough about groundwater inputs to the system at this point, and there's just some really preliminary data and evidence around this. So leading on from all of that to some management recommendations that came out of our review, the expert panel really endorses and supports the idea of strategic rack harvesting. So the idea of this is to really sort of analyse the nature of the shorelines with regards to all of those factors that I was outlining before. You know, the shoreline aspect, and the wind wave energy, and how that impacts on water exchange. So the idea here is to really sort of work with nature and work with the climate or the seasonal variation in winds to improve the circulation and flushing along that nearshore zone. So get to really move that nutrient-rich stormwater into the lake basin where it becomes diluted. Improve rack harvesting methods and explore new methods through upgraded machinery and innovative techniques to clear the rack more efficiently and rapidly. Strategies to reduce that nutrient-rich stormwater input from all of the various stormwater drains. And this can be done through a combination of source reduction strategies. So that's, you know, minimizing the amount of nutrients that actually go into the stormwater drains of the streets. So, you know, not washing your car on your concrete driveway, but rather on your lawn, maybe using, you know, sort of low nutrient detergents, etc. And then looking at sort of stormwater treatment zones. So these sort of things, I've included a picture of a stormwater treatment zone that was created over in the Long Jetty shoreline by Central Coast Council. You know, these ideas have been able to understanding that you can't stop all of the nutrients and sediment coming off the landscape. So then we have to actually try to treat that. So there are innovative ways or emerging ways of doing that. Obviously, given the really huge area of urbanised shoreline, this is hugely costly, but nonetheless. And also exploring opportunities to redirect some of the stormwater flows from those fringing urban catchments into the main creek channels, so Rimba Creek and Wyong Creek. And so that those nutrients end up in the lake basin where they have far less impact than when they get concentrated in that nearshore zone. And another thing is to continue to try to improve the resilience and function of the nearshore zone. So That photo is an example of an attempt to do that. Various attempts to regrade the shoreline, rehabilitate salt marsh, other examples. And I think there's room for improved monitoring of lake conditions, and also the performance of management initiatives. There's through the new emerging generation of smart sensors, so telemetered loggers, so that allow you to actually have observe water quality in real time. And also through the continued employment of citizen science. There's some really great data sets that are being collected by various citizen groups around the lake, which really help us understand where the main hotspots are in terms of pollutant generation and degradation within the lake. But also that, again, citizen science can help through emerging technologies such as drone imagery and actually just reporting on localized conditions. All of this information really helps us to better understand the nature of the problems, because I guess I would make the point that while we've tried to really analyze the available data, and I think we've come up with some very strong conclusions, there's still a lot we don't really understand about how the system works, and so ongoing monitoring, I think, is essential. And as part of that, really, that this information and this sort of process really needs to continue to engage the community. I think there's a huge role to sort of for the community to play in terms of helping us, helping scientists like myself and the expert panel better understand the lake, but also to improve the understanding within the community of how the lakes function and what a unique system they live on and enjoy. So at that, I'll stop rabbiting on and hand it back over to Stuart. And
yes, thanks, Angus. Excellent. So yeah, good. Thanks for that. And lots of good comments and questions coming in there. So I want to dive straight in. And just on that last comment you made about community engagement and community being able to provide information, I can see one individual who'd be very keen to provide information about RAC management. Just in chat today, not mentioning any names, Dave Eaton, but look, fair point. And I want to go to that as the first question, just because we sort of ended there. And there's some people have been asking tonight, and people have been talking the whole year about what do we mean by RAC harvesting, and is harvesting a good thing, and how do we know? You've talked about tonight improved harvesting. Could you just talk a little bit more about what you mean about that? What do you think RAC harvesting looks like? And for some it's a controversial thing. So could you just talk about that a bit more?
Sure. So I'll start by saying that RAC is a natural phenomenon within the lake system. We have a shallow lake system which supports as I said, one of the largest seagrass stands along the coast of New South Wales. RAC is a consequence of having seagrass. So and it plays an ecological function, but we recognise also that due to a combination of shoreline modification and other factors, the RAC isn't really being distributed like it was naturally. So there is definitely a role and for RAC harvesting. So RAC harvesting is basically the collection of RAC and exporting that RAC out of the lake system. So that's traditionally been done by the harvester that moves around the lake, and also in other times by the use of a truck saw, which is sort of a waterborne type of tractor. But essentially, when I allude to strategic harvesting, what I'm meaning is that we harvest, we create, first of all, we create some areas of the lake where rack is allowed to accumulate and form its natural function. So Tuggerah Bay to the northern, in between Arimba Creek and Wyong Creek on the western side of the lake, has been identified as one of these rack reserves. It's not causing any problem. Whereas say, for example, along other shorelines like Berkeley Vale or Long Jetty, it's obviously causing a problem due to that decoupling and barrier effect. So the aim with the strategic harvesting of that rack is to move into is to harvest rack from there, and reduce that barrier effect when that shoreline is more likely to be influenced by winds that will force water currents along that shoreline, and therefore create dilute that nutrient-rich water from the stormwater channels into the lake basin. So it's really about working strategically through the season with nature to sort of maximise the wind-driven currents in the lake.
Good. Okay. Thank you. There's comments coming in, and again, this reflects questions gathered recently and throughout the whole process. Again, it's the seemingly self-evident connection between an open entrance and cleaner water. There's a question here tonight about it. It seems to locals that when the entrance has been open for a while, the water feels cleaner. You've talked a little bit about that. I'm interested, can you talk a bit more about the connection between entrance being open, not open, and water quality? Can you just sort of unpack that a little bit more?
Well, I guess, obviously, as I said, around the entrance and in that entrance channel up as far as the bridge and perhaps beyond, an open entrance will definitely influences water quality. The water on an incoming tide and a high tide, that water is largely oceanic. As for the rest of the lake, as I say, the data suggests that other factors are much more important in terms of determining the sort of water quality that you would measure on a day-to-day basis. The only measurable thing that we see in the data is a gradual increase in salinity within the lake basin whilst the entrance is open. The sort of water quality that you see on any particular shoreline, whether it be Canton Beach, Long Jetty or Berkeley Vale or Tumby, that really has more to do with how the winds and rainfall and lake level has been over the preceding 2 to 3 months. So, for example, if we look at the water level since the entrance opened, due to the big flood in early 2020, the water level has been much higher than it was prior to that. So that barrier effect that I was talking about, that decouples the basin from the nearshore zone, was much less during that period. So you're probably around the lake, you were much less likely to see those sort of bad water quality and ooze type problems developing during that time.
So are you saying then, I think you are, that if the lake level is a little higher, when the lake level is a little higher, that decoupling is less, the shoreline water looks a little cleaner or is a little cleaner, is that?
Yeah. So if you look, you think there's the barrier and here's the water level. When the water level's low, the water inside the barrier is, it's trapped and stagnant. And when the water level rises, there's greater opportunity for some exchange with the lake basin between that barrier. So what I'm saying, and what I'm saying that is, there are a lot of factors at play, and those factors vary around the lake, and certainly, the sort of that spring neap tidal forcing that causes the lake level to vary over a fortnightly period. And David can step in here, but that the amount of fortnightly level variation really relates to how efficient the entrance is at that time. So if the entrance is very constrained, that fortnightly tide is going to be less than if it's really open. Yeah, David, would you like to step in there?
I guess my opinion on that is a bit mixed, because obviously when the thing's completely closed, you don't get any fortnightly tides. No. It seems like there's a real sort of sweet spot where you will get that variation, where it's enhanced. If an entrance is like incredibly open, you don't get that variation.
Right.
It's a if you want to get technical about it, it's known as tidal pumping, and the more constrained the entrance is, the more that tidal pumping effect will be seen. But there's a limit to that. If you close off the entrance too much, then you don't get that. So if it's if it's completely closed, of course, there's no tidal variation inside.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess that I was trying to oversimplify things, and but it really goes to my point that what we observe around the lake is due to a complex interaction of lots of different factors.
Okay. And the thing I noticed tonight, and I've seen various presentations from you over the years, but it struck me really for the first time. Maybe I haven't been paying close enough attention. Your picture from the past, the 1920s or whenever it was, the water was clear, water quality was good, the lake. The entrance was natural, and it's never really struck me before. And there's a lot of concern about training the lake in order to improve water quality, and it's just struck me tonight that in the past the entrance has been untrained, and yet the water quality was good then. So make of that what you will, but that's my own realisation. Just from
I'll just provide a little bit of information. The entrance was completely closed at the time that 1940s photo was taken. So there was a period for about 2 to 3 years, I think, David, when it was completely closed in the early 40s. So essentially what we were looking at in that 1940s photo is the system in a very different or alternate state. It's sort of the culmination of, or the combination of various pressures in subsequent decades has caused, a fundamental shift in the system state. So the turbidity in the lake basin is increased, so that seagrass has moved up, all of those things that I described.
Yeah. Okay. So interesting. Some comments. Again, this has been an issue that's come up a bit, and again tonight is the power station. You briefly touched on the power station, its closure, and any impact. There's been some questions about has that changed the thermal properties? Has that had any impact on the seagrass? What do we know about that? Has there been any impact? Has the closure of the power station had any impact on water quality as you've seen it?
Well, as I said, it has definitely. The shutting down of that circulation, due to the cooling water, intake from Lake Munmore and discharge to Budgie, that has tended to decouple Munmore from Budgie in terms of exchange somewhat, so that, as I said, Munmore has become less salty whilst the entrance is open. In terms of other water quality properties, there's really not enough evidence to suggest that there has been. It's really inconclusive. I reviewed the in terms of pollutants like sediment contamination. There was a Cardno report done in 2014 that looked at sediments in the ash dam and in various parts of the system close to the power station, and I think they found that all contaminants were below the guidelines for the protection of aquatic ecosystems, with the exception of one instance of higher copper. So that was, I found that quite surprising. I think there's evidence from Lake Macquarie that shows contamination. But yes, there's no real evidence from Munmore. Okay. So I think there has been in the past issues with water quality in that cooling water channel, and certainly that was highlighted as an issue.
Okay, all right, good, thanks. And I'm just turning my eye more to these questions, and I know Tony's been very patiently over 3 nights asking questions, and seems he's asking what seems to be a self-evident thing, that if the entrance is open, doesn't that mean we get more nutrients and rack and stuff flushed out of the lake? It seems that feels logical. So again, how would you respond to that?
Well, I guess this might be probably a question for David. I think I would sort of start by saying, due to the trapping effect of the problem nutrients along the shoreline, and the fact that tidal flushing is far less or efficient or even non-existent along much of that shoreline, tends to be the flushing effects tends to be disproportionately skewed towards the lake water, the water in the lake basin. Therefore, it's not really having the sort of impacts that we would like it to have along the parts of the lake that we mostly interact with. David, do you want to add to that? I don't know.
Well, I guess, Angus, it comes back to this point of the typical tidal range only being a couple of centimetres inside, say, Tuggerah Lakes, and unless it's scoured out, you might get up to 8 centimetres or something like that after a big flood. It's still not a huge exchange, so we're only looking maybe up to 3, maybe 5% in best conditions. Mm-hmm. So the question is about whether we can improve it enough to affect what's going around the near shore. And based on your observations, Angus, my understanding is that it's not enough. And the stuff that I've seen from looking at the way that the lake changes during a flood, it just seems to dominate everything. The amount of volume that's getting exchanged coming off the catchment and then going out through the entrance after a flood is much larger and more dramatic than what we get on each tide.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I just there's some questions from earlier on, and I just want to make sure we get to them. There's a number of people asking in a number of ways about things flowing in, and I don't know, Angus, the extent, we heard from Nicole the other night about the catchment issues, and these are relevant to that. But people are talking about nutrients getting into the lake through leaking sewers from the sewer works. Someone else has mentioned Kangiangi, the rail maintenance facility. Tony's talking about nutrients through the creeks. How significant are these ultimately to issues of water quality, these sorts of things?
Well, all of them, any point sources I think are very, very important. So, discharges of, I know stormwater drains are a point source, but things, I think the groundwater, I think, as I alluded to in the presentation, groundwater is potentially a very significant issue, because that is a major pathway of pollutants into the lake, especially during times outside of floods. So we know that in the 80s and early 90s, there was a huge issue with macroalgae blooms along Canton Beach that were documented. That was found to be due to the leakage of that. At the time, Canton Beach was on septics, those macroalgae blooms were found to be associated with the leakage of nutrient-rich septic effluent through those very permeable sands and into the nearshore zone. So that sort of thing highlights the importance of understanding where those groundwater pathways are. I just sort of make the point, going back to what David said as well. If you look at the wider catchment, the vast bulk of on an annual basis, on a yearly basis, the vast bulk of material that comes into the lake system occurs during these large floods, and most of it tends to skate out through the entrance and out into the ocean. A certain amount is obviously retained in the lake basin, and then that's distributed, very quickly mixed by these wind waves, and wind-driven currents, and then that material is then sort of reworked. But it's, in terms of what we observe for most of the time through the year, it's these smaller inputs, these little pulses of nutrient-rich or pollutant-rich groundwater and stormwater, and discharges. That's really what makes the difference.
Okay, thank you. And there are some questions, and this is, I guess, more for Nicole as well, but I just wonder if you have an opinion. Given the planned future development, what do you think is the connection between how planning is done, might be done, could be done, and the sorts of things you're seeing as impacts on water quality? How do you see those? Are you able to comment on that?
Well, I think that probably harks back to this idea that those various management strategies, we really want to try to design our urban landscapes in a way to minimise the generation of pollutants. So, water-sensitive urban designs, sort of permeable stormwater drains, and I would say that probably avoid the situation where we have, urban developments discharging into that nearshore zone. So really discharging into the creeks is probably via, appropriate treatment devices is probably the only way I can see of minimising the impacts of urban development into the future.
Okay. Sure, that's fine. And I don't know, Will or Dave,
Well, I was just interested. There was another question there. There's two others that came earlier in the piece that I thought I'm interested to hear Angus's answer to. One was around if we fixed up the groundwater foreshore, Angus, do you think it might go back to putting the seagrass in the middle? Which is one of Greg's Howard's questions before, or do you think it's pretty hard to recover to what we've got now?
I think there's a lot of resistance. It's one of those to going back to that way, because what we've got now is the sediment, the fine sediment that's accumulated in that lake basin is stirred up on every wind event, and that turbidity just basically means that there's not enough light for the seagrass to move down into that lake basin.
So it's hard to get back. Yeah,
it's very hard to get back. It's what we call, there's been a state shift in the system. It's flipped from one state to another, and it's very, you've got to push the ball back over this big hill for it to actually fall into that other state. But but that's not to say that we can't improve. We can't strive for a much more healthy version of what we have at present. So, and that's where the the strategic rack harvesting and all of these other things that we've been talking about.
And there was another question along the same lines. It was early in the piece. With regards to harvesting of rack and council work on rack and everything else. What would you suggest individuals could do to assist in improving the lakefront or actively promoting better lake frontage and the way they're working right now?
I think that I think that there is. I think there's if that wide scale subscription to this concept of strategic rack harvesting, and citizen science in terms of monitoring the rack dynamics, and if we can report that back to council to help that strategic rack harvesting plan evolve in real time. So that's one thing. Probably, I think a certain amount, this is probably, I think there's a certain amount of acceptance of the lake, the beast that it is. So that, acceptance of rack and that we will never actually get to a sort of we'll never get back to the 1940s or pre-1940s, one. So the lake is full of seagrass. That is, provides an ecological function. It's a very valuable ecological function. Rack is part of that. So there are certain, I think there's a certain amount of acceptance of the lake, the unique features of the lake, which would help. So that would help, people be sort of more supportive of the directions or that strategic rack management issue, rather than being very reactive. I know that I'm not answering your question in terms of what they can do on there for sure. I think everyone has to promote this idea of a natural foreshore and allow the promotion of low gradient shorelines, natural salt marsh, accommodating water level variation within that lake margin. So not trying to sort of mow right up to the lake edge. Just having that buffer zone that belongs to the lake. Reducing everyone within those fringing catchments, really working hard to reduce the pollutants, nutrients and sediments going into the stormwater system. All of those things will help. I think that, I always bang on about this being a death by 1,000 cuts. Everyone is contributing a small bit to the overall problem. The overall problem is sort of this accumulation of impacts.
Thanks, Angus. So there's a question from Jane about potential or concern about pollutants in the Arimba Creek catchment. Do you know much about that? Have you seen anything to be concerned about there, or any impact on the lake?
No, I'm sorry, I don't really have any information at hand. Sorry.
Yeah,
but I'm happy to look further into that and report.
It might be something that Nicole would be better off.
Well, 2 nights ago we talked about the ash dams and the metals coming off, and there was a lot of concern. And I know, Angus, you probably know that some of that better than others. Is the metal pollution from the ash dams a concern? Is it a high impact? Is it something we need to be active about?
No, look, I mean, as I said, the only information I have to go off is that Cardno report that from 2014. None of the samples taken there were, red flags. There possibly nutrient inputs. I think it's possibly. I noticed that there were some responses in the comments, observing algal blooms in the vicinity. And I did notice in the Cardno report that there were elevated concentration of nutrients associated with sediments and water quality in the. So there is potentially, an issue due to that, nutrients and algal blooms. Metals, at this point, it's not to say unfortunately the Cardno report didn't really give a detailed map of the sample location, so I really couldn't. And there were very few samples taken, so it's very hard to make a very sort of educated assessment.
You're being given some advice of what to read there in chat, so that's some pointers. There's also, I noticed, a question about sea level rise, and I don't know if that's anything you've considered projecting forward. What could be the impact on water quality of sea level rise? Is that something that you've pondered?
It's not something that we've really comprehensively assessed. I know that from the coastal inundation mapping, we could well end up with the second entrance up at the Budgie sandmass. David, you might want to step in here, but I know that David Hanslow's sea level coastal inundation mapping shows that essentially becoming a second entrance there. I would say that probably what we're looking at is a system that becomes more saline, more ocean dominated. Obviously, all of those dynamics of the nearshore zone will probably change significantly.
Okay.
Yeah, David, do you want to add anything?
I might jump in and say, so if you were here 2 nights ago, you'd know we talked a lot about development in the catchment. And if you're asking what are the biggest threats to water quality in the catchment, and you had climate change, and development, I think we'd probably lean towards the fact that we're going to have so many more people and so much development in the catchment that unless that's done, and managed well in the next 15, 20, 30 years, as the numbers suggest, climate change is just an extra stressor on top of everything else.
Yeah.
So that's really not kicking in till 2070, 2080, 2100. That's when the pressure's really kicking. Whereas development in Central Coast is kicking now, and it's really with 2050 a much bigger impact.
Yeah. That's right. It's there's going to be much bigger changes associated with what Will's talking about in the interim.
I'm just going through my list of questions that are appearing. Has anything else jumped out at you? Dave or Will, have you seen anything while Angus has been talking?
I'm just looking myself.
I think most of the things I've seen that sort of had my interest, you've picked up already, or other people have picked up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the time, it's just about time for us to be wrapping up in any case, having a little look through now. Yeah. So, folks, I think I'm going to wrap it up there. I hope that's been useful. Thanks for your energetic comments there. That's been it's really quite interesting to see just how much knowledge and interest is there. And thanks, Angus, also for your excellent presentation. That was I learned some things again, despite having seen it before. So I don't know, Will, have you got anything to say? I guess the question I might ask, Will, is where to from here for the report, for the panel, for all of that stuff.
And so I'll say a few things just to wrap up here. One, I'll say that just so everyone else is aware, what we did within the panel is we would each week challenge each other to prove each other wrong, right? So we got towards the end there where Dave would come in and lay out his thesis and his evidence, and we would poke holes in it. We would, as best as we could, try to find how we thought he was wrong and what evidence did he have to back that up. And we did the same thing with Angus and the same thing with Nicole and the same thing with Stuart. So we were trying to find our own holes, and we know that none of this is perfect, but what we tried to put together was the most comprehensive pathway we could find that we all trusted in. So, and where we didn't know, we identified that these are gaps and we think they should be worked on. And, we have laid those out. So that's as far as we could take it with the information we had at hand. And I hope that was helpful. I hope that we were able to, the whole idea of these 3 nights was to talk about where we were coming from, the information we've had, and how people that care, it's obvious how passionate you guys are about the system, that you can see where we're coming from. And it doesn't have to end here, the conversation. We've made a recommendation that there's many things happen. One, that the multitude of recommendations we have are taken up, and ideally they're taken up immediately within parts of the coastal management program by local government and by state government through a number of programs they've got running, and a shared responsibility, but also through the community. So we're really trying to make sure that we're sharing the load through everyone. And as I've said both nights, we've also recommended that there's an independent group brought in to try to bring people together again and have a conversation based on science that will guide that through. I saw a comment, it was really a comment before about, well, what about the town planners and the engineers, and and they all have to be in the room. And certainly one of the things we said in our report was the stormwater group has to be in the room, and they have to be looking at what we're doing with planning. And there's no way that planning can take the planning proceeds and not put them back into the environment, where people care. So I do, and I think the rest of the panel encourages people in this room to continue to rattle the cage and continue to seek for some of these recommendations to be implemented. I certainly will be, and hopefully we'll hear more about that soon. So I'll just wrap up by, I guess this is I think the last time I'll sit in front of you as an expert panel chair. So thank you on behalf of the panel. We are really grateful that people show up to these things to begin with. I mean, who knows when we put this out if you're even going to come. So I know it's your weeknight. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being really eager and active. We'll try to make sure that all the information's out there. If you don't have something, let us know. There are no hard copies. There's a soft copy. I see that report from Gary. I don't have a hard copy. It's all just electronics. You could get it printed somewhere, but we don't have one now. And but hopefully there will be a summary report coming out, which may be too small for someone like you, Gary, but it may be helpful for others. And we are hoping to print some of those, which is sort of 20-page summary document of everything in there. And so thanks for everyone involved, and I hope you have a lovely night, and hopefully we can make a difference on Tuggerah Lakes. So Back to you,
Thanks,
Stuart.
Will. Thanks, everyone. It's been terrific. And I guess that is, well, we haven't really been a panel for 8 months now, but that's probably the last time we can even pretend to be the panel. So thank you, everyone. It's been an honour and a privilege.